In the lead up to the first major cultural touchstone of 2023, HBO's television series The Last of Us, video game fans were treated to an all-timer quote from co-creator Craig Mazin, who, in an interview with Empire Magazine, claimed, "It's an open and shut case. The Last of Us is the greatest story that's ever been told in video games." Doubling down later in the interview, he explained what made The Last of Us so special. They were just people, and that, in and of itself, is remarkably rare in games. The fact they kept it so grounded and really made you feel. I had never experienced anything like that, and I've been playing video games since 1977. Many, myself included, wondered aloud if Mazin hadn't just been playing games since 1977, or if that was the last time he picked one up. No one's saying The Last of Us contains a bad story, but the bold declaration that no other game story comes close struck me and many as bizarre. Perhaps, though, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise. Mazin's not a video game guy. He's a writer for movies and television. When he says The Last of Us is the best video game story ever, he is most likely judging the competition not on their merits as stories or their qualities as video games, but as cinematic narratives. If we measure all video games on that scale, as to how well they might hold up as a prestige television drama, then sure, The Last of Us seems like a pretty good pick, especially considering that, it spawned a massively successful and beloved prestige television series. Still, I just can't get over how boneheaded the declaration is. Even if it is press tour speak meant to drum up hype for an expensive television show, it presents such profound dismissive ignorance of an entire art form that it's hard to ignore. You might expect me to jump into the debate and argue, Earthbound has the best story or something. But while I don't think The Last of Us is the greatest story ever told in video games, that's because I don't think a greatest story in video games exists. No, the quote stuck with me because in both it and the surrounding discussion on the internet, I saw a striking amount of people fail to understand what a video game story is, what makes a video game story good, and why video game stories matter. Particularly when people brought up counterexamples. Like moths to a flame, they mindlessly hovered over to the same familiar cinematic kind of story as Last of Us. God of War 2018, Red Dead Redemption, Uncharted, Metal Gear Solid, the usual suspects. In doing so, they fell into the same trap Mazin found himself in, presenting video games as the ugly sister of more established media like film and television. Where did these folks go so wrong? Why did they so utterly fail to understand what video games even are? I already made an entire video about the video game industry's self-consciousness. That's not what this is about. I'm not interested in delineating why we tend to laud most those games which try their best to emulate more established art forms. Instead, I'm intrigued by more fundamental questions. What is a story in the first place? What makes a story good? What makes video game stories unique? I don't think the answers are as straightforward as you might think, and exploring their implications might help you to think about games in a completely new way. Maybe even understand that you've got a lot more video game stories than you might realize. It's surprising how often we can reach an interesting answer by genuinely asking simple questions, like, what is a story? Seems kind of dumb at first glance. We all know what a story is. You've been hearing them since before you even knew what words were. I'm a mom. I've got a 1-year-old sleeping in the other room. I read them books all the time, even though they can't understand them. This is my child's favorite storybook, Polar Bear, What Do You Hear? It's pretty beat up because my child likes to carry it around everywhere they go. My child, I don't think knows that this is a story. I don't think they know what a story is, but they do know it's got interesting pictures, and they know that Mama makes funny sounds when we open it up and read it together. Like when we get to this page with the boa constrictor and I say, hiss, which my child's picked up on, and now hisses with me whenever we get to this page. They've got a couple words, but they don't know what a snake is, but they can make the sound. You too likely heard many stories before you even knew what words were, when all you could do was moo or roar or hiss. When something's been with you so long, it's easy to forget it's not some innate thing in the universe, but a word, a concept with a specific meaning. I suppose we could define a story in a variety of ways. A dramatic plot, a series of incidents, a sequence of written words or moving images, a horizontal division of a building. These definitions are fine, and I'm not here to say I've got the one true understanding of a concept as nuanced as story, but for our conversation today, I'd like to give you one simple way to think about it. A story is an account of change. I like this definition because we've only two keywords to consider: account and change. By account, I mean a telling, a recollection, a description. Put simply, a communication. In order for there to be a story, something must be communicated and heard by another. Not all communications are stories though. If I hold up a can of soda, which I got right here, and I say Dr. Pepper, I've communicated the name of what's in my hand, but not a story. If I say a cat is a furry creature with pointy ears, or I am Evelyn, none of these are, by themselves, a story. Stories require an important second component: change. Something was one way, and now it's another. If I say I went to the store and bought a hat, I've told a story. I was one place, I went to another place, I did not have something, and now I have something. If you're looking, you can find stories everywhere. A gravestone tells a story. Someone was born and they died. Most commercials tell a story. A dissatisfied person does not have the product, then they get the product and bam, they're happy and complete. Even a story where nothing happens, like Waiting for Godot, is an account of change, because no change is still change. The statement, "My cat went to sleep, and 5 hours later she was still asleep," has narrative juice. What changed wasn't my cat, but time itself. Which makes sense, because time is the measure of change. Most stories aren't that good though. You can go to a graveyard if you want to experience a few hundred stories in the span of an hour, but most of them play out the same. Born, lived, died. That's not to say those people's lives were uninteresting, but the gravestone story is. Someday, I'll have a tombstone, and it will say the same thing. She was born, she lived, and she died. Hardly unique, hardly original. So, we've really got to ask, what makes a good story? While I'm sure we could get into all sorts of conversations about culture, pacing, heroes' journeys, poetry, prose, cinematography, acting, or writing, that's not the point of this video, which is, ironically, kind of a story itself. So here's a definition of a good story that's simple and easy to wrap your head around. A good story is one which changes the audience. I see we've counted that pesky word again, change. I don't simply mean you watched Okja and became a vegetarian. That would be a pretty dramatic change. I just mean the person you were before you encountered the story and the person you were after are different. The degree of that change represents how good a story is. If you watch a TV show and it's something you can't stop thinking about, something that changes the way that you act, then it's a pretty good TV show. I use good in this way because the goal of most stories is to change the audience, give them a new perspective, Make them think about something they otherwise wouldn't. Convince them that one action may be better than another. If an account of change can do that, it's a pretty good one. On the contrary, if you read a book and promptly forget about it, never dwelling on its contents again, it's probably not a good story, at least not from your perspective. Along those lines, you may be curious to know what a great story is, like The Last of Us reportedly is. I would simply define a great story as one which changes the audience in perpetuity. Some stories are good. They stick in your mind for a while. The version of you is different for a bit, but then you bounce back, and it didn't have a lasting effect. That's okay. That's natural even. Nothing to be ashamed of. A great story, though, retains its value, resides in your thoughts forever, or at least until you got no more thoughts left to think. When I recommend a film or book or TV show to someone, it's because it changed me. And I guess I'd like to see that change in someone else. The greatest stories I've seen or read didn't just stick with me for a time, but molded me, had a permanent effect on who I am. For instance, in my Sekiro video, I reminisced about watching Akira Kurosawa's film Yojimbo in high school and how it inspired my lifelong love of cinema. So, as you can see, a great story can have a cascading effect on an individual's life. I can never be a person who hasn't watched Yojimbo because that's who I am. And it's not just me. I was listening to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, big recommend by the way, and discovered Chernyshevsky's 1863 novel, What Is to Be Done, and its profound effect on multiple generations of Russian revolutionaries. In the book, Vera, the lead character, desiring economic and personal freedom, absconds from an arranged marriage and starts up a commune, and ends up in a polyamorous relationship aspiring to be a doctor. For many Russian revolutionaries, theorists like Marx provided an underpinning to their politics, but What Is to Be Done gave them that all too important emotional motivation to act. Vladimir Lenin was obsessed with the book and even used its title for one of his most important revolutionary pamphlets. It's crazy to think one story can be so powerful as to shape the political future of a country and even the whole world, but it genuinely happens all the time. So, okay, good stories change us. Great stories change us forever or in perpetuity. I know they're not perfect definitions, and I'm sure you can come up with slight alternatives. I can too, but these definitions center why stories are important in the first place, why we bother to tell them. Yeah, a good story might also be something entertaining or whatever, but if it doesn't stick with you, it honestly doesn't matter. That's personally my problem with superhero films and most other big budget special effects driven stuff that have dominated the box office and discussion in cinema for recent years. The stories bounce off me like a bullet off Superman's chiseled chest. I could tell you what happened in these movies, but I just don't care. They didn't affect me at all. To give a counterexample, one of my favorite films is Hirokazu Koreeda's 2008 masterpiece, Still Walking, in which a broken family gathers to commemorate the anniversary of their eldest son's death. I think about Still Walking all the time. Scenes cooking fried corn cakes, visiting graves, and reminiscing about love songs live rent-free in my head. But it isn't only little moments that come back to me. Still Walking is about the giant hole left in your life, in a family's life, when someone passes away. About how personal connections don't always repair, how some things break and remain broken. I literally cried while writing that paragraph yesterday. Still Walking gave me the words, the metaphors, to understand life in a new way. And ever since I saw it, I became a different person. One with a more solemn perspective on family and death, which motivates me to cherish what I have more. If two me's existed, one who saw Still Walking and one who didn't, they would be two different people. And that shows just how powerful a story can be. So, it's finally time to turn our attention to video game stories. What makes a good one? Well, to get the obvious out of the way, a good video game story changes you, right? Just like any good story would. just like how still walking changed me. But ideally, it leverages the unique strengths of video games in the pursuit of changing you. In this regard, video games have a lot going for them. One obvious area games differentiate themselves from books or films is in the element of narrative choice. Mass Effect and games of its ilk allow the player to roleplay a character who faces difficult dilemmas and consequences of their actions, which heightens immersion, allowing the player to feel like they're an integral part of the experience. Meanwhile, a game like Undertale gives the player a narratively dissatisfying but ludically easier path to victory via violence, or a much more difficult but narratively palatable peaceful route. The player's reaction to these systems and the internal conflicts that they yield offer us one unique avenue by which video games can tell stories and emotionally impact their audience. But despite being the center of a lot of conversations around game stories, narrative choice isn't the only area where games have massive potential. Games house within them shades of all other media. A film or television show cannot just cram a novel or short story for the audience to read on the corner of the screen. But in essence, that's exactly what Skyrim does with all the random novels lying around the game's various nooks and crannies. Meanwhile, games like Control throw actual live action videos into the mix to break up their more traditional gameplay. Because play is player-paced, games are free to play around with narrative forms. Text, voice acting, cinematic breaks, or even the user interface are all tools games can play with to tell their stories that other media can't, at least not as easily. But these aren't the issues Mazin and his detractors ran into when discussing the greatest video game story. No, they fundamentally misunderstood what a video game story can be. A video game story isn't just when Joel and Ellie have a chat during a ladder puzzle, or when Cloud dresses up as a girl to fool a crime lord. No, everything you do in a video game is a story. When you first played World 1-1 and jumped over a bottomless pit, that's a story, an account of change. It's a story when you beat your brother in Pong. It's a story when you glitch through the map in Cyberpunk and die. It's a story when you lose to a raid boss in World of Warcraft. It's a story when you shoot a demon in Doom, because video games are uniquely about change. Press a button and something happens. You'll always get a story out of it. Designers don't just craft written narratives, they provide you with the conditions to create your own stories. We live in the golden era of such video game stories. The most popular games in the world are almost all make-your-own-story affairs. Fortnite is about the pursuit of greatness and being number one. I'm sure most players can excitedly recount the story of their first victory. Each League of Legends match tells a story of two teams in mortal conflict, advancing their goals while undermining their opponents. Among Us provides its players with tales of betrayal and deceit. Perhaps the most iconic game of our time, Minecraft, tantalizes the player with endless possibilities, endless stories for them to create themselves. I still fondly remember the time my friend failed to heed our warnings and died to a lake of lava, taking all of our diamonds with him. And that was 10 years ago. And no matter how much people love to dive into the lore of Dark Souls or Elden Ring, what initially hooks people on FromSoft games are the satisfying stories of conquering their challenges. Personally, I felt more powerful and lasting emotions from Hearthstone than some intentional narrative experiences like Far Cry. Those feelings don't come from nowhere. They're the result of a story lived, one that stayed with me, adjusted who I am. Many of my most memorable video game stories have nothing to do with traditional narratives. Playing Super Smash Bros. Melee until the sun came up with my friends in middle school. Figuring out how to slay the first boss of Shadow of the Colossus. Playing Ico and holding Yorda's hand for the first time on the display TV and PlayStation 2 at my local Walmart and realizing, wow, games can be so much more than jumping and shooting. It wasn't good acting, writing, or character design that pulled me into these moments, created these stories. It was me, the player, living them. I played through 2016's The Witness during the worst week of my life. Its spiritual prequel, Braid, was and is one of the most interesting games I've ever played. So, despite being on vacation in Thailand on release day, I purchased the game and started playing. I was also in the middle of a week-long, but experientially never-ending anxiety attack. My life was on the precipice of massive change, and I had no clue how I got where I was or where I was going. I was terrified. To escape the pain, I dove into the game, obsessed over it, skipped nearly all vacation activities with my wife and friends to sit in a dark hotel room lit only by the glow of my laptop screen. The Witness is specifically about loneliness, and despite feeling lonely every day of my life, I've never felt as lonely as I did on the Witness's little island, solving tricky puzzles in the hope one might stump me long enough to forget myself. But that puzzle never came. I beat the game in Thailand and left it there. It's one of the best I've ever played, but I can't go back. Every time I've tried, I feel sick to my stomach with grief, like I've turned on a video of a deadly car crash where I was the victim. The Witness hit me at a specific time and place, and is now part of me in a way few stories are. I know it has its own story, but I just don't care. My story of The Witness is infinitely more emotionally resonant than anything Jonathan Blow could come up with, and that's all that matters. The most important stories of our lives do not come from storytellers. They come from within, because every memory you have is a story, an account of change. The greatest among them, no, great does not mean morally good, are those which most profoundly influence who you are and what you do. The idea of who you are is, in part, a series of stories you've collected. Games allow us to become the tellers of our own tales. I can explain what happens at the end of The Wind Waker, but it's nothing compared to the sense of freedom imprinted on me from riding the open seas on the King of Red Lions. Sure, I cried when I finished Outer Wilds. The swelling music and compelling final act moved me, but they were set up for success because of the exhilaration I had when I put the game's final puzzle pieces together. These stories live on in my head. No one told them to me, but using these games, I gave them to myself. And yes, I do think The Last of Us gives us one of the greatest stories in video games. But not because Ellie and Joel feel like real people, though I suppose that doesn't hurt, but because of the game's infamously abrasive finale. I hated what I made Joel do in the final scene. It felt cruel and unnecessary, created that dreadful ludonarrative dissonance. But the disharmony made the game memorable. It wasn't just a good third-person shooter with great characters I played once. It became something bigger, a thorn in my side, a question left unanswered, something to gnaw on. Why did Joel do that? Why did I let him? The Last of Us continues to resonate with me. The friction of that narrative moment, the inversion of player and character, who takes orders from whom. I still don't know how I feel about it, so it's stuck with me for a decade as a symbol of the power of video game stories. So yeah, The Last of Us is not bad. Ultimately, if you want to be moved by art, you have to let a work of art change you. Video games are spectacular at getting you to open up and let the change happen. We do it naturally without thinking, when we learn how to dodge roll a boss's attack in Dark Souls, or figure out how to solve a difficult puzzle in Portal. We let the game change us, teach us something, and leave us as someone different than we were before. The games that changed me most, gave me my most important stories like Super Mario 64, didn't do so simply because someone came up with a clever plot twist, but because their designers gave me the tools to tell my own story, change myself, as long as I was willing to put in the effort. I'm sure if you think about it in these terms, you'll find You got a sea of video game stories just as great as Citizen Kane, The Sopranos, or The Last of Us. Each one memorable because it's uniquely yours. I'm Mirror. Ought to find another great story. Signing off.